I think his whole makeup, his whole mystique was really that of tourism.
We looked at other engines. We looked at some GE 80, center cab 80 tonners that were down in Everett, Mass, a collection of steam locomotives, and Nelson had amassed a large collection.
A millionaire seafood tycoon spent his fortune buying abandoned steam locomotives that nobody else wanted. He collected over 100 pieces of railroad history, built a museum to house them, and dreamed of preserving the steam era for future generations. Then he died in a plane crash, and everything he built began falling apart. What happened to America's largest private railroad collection reveals how quickly history can rust away.
The creator of Steamtown, USA. So will the real Nelson Blount please stand up?
The second thing was they wanted to lease on a long term the Steamtown Museum.
F. Nelson Blount was born in 1918 and grew up near the New Haven Railroad in New England, where passing trains captured his imagination from childhood. He spent his youth chasing locomotives with his friend Frederick H. Richardson, documenting what they saw and dreaming of someday owning the machines they loved. By the 1930s, the two had co-authored a rail fan book called Along the Iron Trail, establishing Blount as someone whose passion for railroads ran deeper than casual hobby. The abandonment of narrow gauge lines like the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad in Maine affected Blount deeply. He watched his railroads he loved disappeared, their equipment scrapped or left to rot when diesel locomotives made steam power obsolete. The experience planted a seed that would grow into an obsession with saving what remained of the steam era before it vanished entirely. Blount built his fortune in the seafood industry, founding the Narragansett Seafood Company and growing it into a profitable enterprise that made him a millionaire. The business gave him resources that most railroad enthusiasts could only dream about, and he decided to use that wealth to preserve the locomotives that American railroads were discarding as fast as they could replace them with diesels. In 1955, Blount began acquiring steam locomotives, starting with the narrow gauge equipment from the Edaville Railroad in South Carver, Massachusetts. His collection grew rapidly as he purchased engines from railroads eager to dispose of obsolete power. By 1959, he'd acquired Canadian National Railway No. 47, a tank engine built in 1914 that would become one of the first locomotives used for public excursions. Blount's acquisitions were strategic rather than random. He sought diverse representations of steam railroading, from geared Shay locomotives used in logging operations to high-speed Pacific-type engines designed for passenger service. He wanted his collection to tell the complete story of North American steam power, preserving examples that might otherwise have been lost forever. By 1960, he'd assembled one of the largest private collections in the United States. In 1961, Blount incorporated the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern Railroad Amusement Corporation to operate tourist excursions using his growing collection. He began running trains on the Claremont and Concord Railway in New Hampshire, using Canadian National No. 47 to pull Boston and Maine coaches filled with paying passengers. The operation proved that public interest in steam railroading remained strong even as the technology disappeared from commercial service. Early operations faced setbacks when maintenance records revealed boiler issues that required attention before safe operation could continue. The challenges of keeping antique locomotives running safely became apparent immediately, but Blount pressed forward, determined to share his collection with the public rather than letting it sit idle as a static display. In 1963, Blount established the nonprofit Steamtown Foundation for the Preservation of Steam and Railroad Americana, transferring most of his collection to the organization for tax benefits and long-term preservation. The foundation gave the operation a more permanent structure and allowed donors to contribute with tax deductions, broadening the base of support beyond Blount's personal fortune. The collection found its first permanent home at a former Boston and Maine engine facility in North Walpole, New Hampshire, which Blount named Steamtown, USA. The museum officially opened in 1963, displaying locomotives and rolling stock while planning for expansion. But the site proved too small for Blount's ambitions, and he began searching for a larger location that could accommodate his vision. After failed negotiations in Keene, New Hampshire, the collection moved in 1964 to an 18-acre site in Riverside near Bellows Falls, Vermont. The property sat adjacent to the abandoned Rutland Railroad, providing both space for display and access to tracks for excursion operations. The move involved covert nighttime towing of equipment to avoid legal disputes, demonstrating the lengths Blunt would go to realize his vision. In Vermont, Blunt established the Green Mountain Railroad for freight operations and used its track for steam excursions that took passengers over covered bridges and through scenic gorges. Locomotives like Canadian Pacific numbers 1246 and 1293 powered these trips, attracting visitors eager to experience steam railroading firsthand. Blunt envisioned a grand museum with a roundhouse, a recreated railroad village, and educational exhibits that would keep steam alive for generations. By the time of the Vermont relocation, Blunt had assembled approximately 25 steam locomotives from the United States and Canada, along with 10 other locomotives, 25 pieces of rolling stock, and various artifacts including cabooses, coaches, and maintenance equipment. The collection represented a broad spectrum of North American rail history and even included pieces from Europe. The centerpiece acquisitions demonstrated Blunt's ambition to preserve the most significant examples of steam power. Union Pacific Big Boy number 4012, weighing over 1 million pounds, represented the pinnacle of American steam locomotive development. Built in 1941, the massive 4884 articulated locomotive had hauled wartime freight over the Wasatch Mountains. Its sheer size would later make it impossible to operate, condemning it to static display. Canadian Pacific contributed several important pieces to the collection. Pacific-type locomotives numbered 1246, 1278, 1293, 2317, and 2929 represented the workhorses of Canadian passenger service. The 2929 was particularly significant as a rare 444 Jubilee type, the only example of its kind in the United States. Geared locomotives added diversity to the collection. Shea engines, designed for the steep grades and tight curves of logging railroads, operated differently from mainline power and represented an important branch of steam development. Meadow River Lumber's Shea No. 1, built by Lima in 1910, exemplified this specialized technology. Rolling stock expanded the story beyond locomotives. Blunt acquired coaches, diners, and cabooses that illustrated how passengers and freight traveled during the steam era. One notable piece was the dining car Mountaineer, which had served President Franklin D. Roosevelt during his travels. International acquisitions added unexpected variety. Locomotives from Britain, France, Germany, Ireland, and Belgium joined the collection, giving Steamtown a global perspective on steam railroading that distinguished it from purely American museums. These pieces would later prove problematic when questions arose about the collection's focus and relevance. The collection grew faster than anyone could maintain it. And do us a favor, subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next to this collection. On August 31st, 1967, F. Nelson Blunt died in a plane crash at age 49. The visionary who'd assembled America's largest private railroad collection was gone, and with him went the personal fortune and driving energy that had sustained the enterprise from the beginning. The Steamtown Foundation continued operations under new leadership, but the loss of Blunt created immediate challenges. His personal funding had covered gaps that ticket sales and donations couldn't fill. Without his financial backing, the foundation had to find other ways to pay for the expensive work of maintaining steam locomotives and keeping excursions running safely. Edgar T. Meade served as president from 1967 to 1973, focusing on protecting equipment during Vermont's harsh winters and organizing events like Rail Fans Day to attract visitors. His leadership stabilized operations during the difficult transition period, but resources remained limited compared to what Blunt had provided. Robert Barbera took over from 1973 to 1980, boosting marketing efforts through films and special events. The 1976 Vermont Bicentennial Steam Expedition carried 23,000 passengers, demonstrating continued public interest in steam excursions. However, the event incurred financial losses despite the strong attendance, highlighting the difficulty of operating historic equipment profitably. Attendance peaked at 65,000 visitors in 1973, a respectable number that suggested the foundation might achieve sustainability. But external forces were about to combine with internal weaknesses to undermine everything Blunt had built. The energy crisis of the 1970s raised fuel costs dramatically, making steam operations more expensive, just as visitors had less money to spend on leisure travel. Vermont's environmental regulations created additional obstacles, requiring annual waivers for coal-burning locomotives that became increasingly difficult to obtain as air quality concerns grew. The foundation that Blunt created was about to face challenges that would nearly destroy his collection. The problems that would eventually force Steamtown out of Vermont accumulated steadily through the late 1970s. Track maintenance disputes with the Green Mountain Railroad created operational headaches, while safety violations led to the suspension of excursions entirely in 1980 and 1981. The foundation that Blunt had created was struggling to maintain basic operations. Board resignations in 1980 exposed management issues that had festered beneath the surface. Allegations of mismanagement circulated, and the organization's leadership structure proved unable to handle the complex challenges of operating a steam railroad museum without its founder's resources and vision. Vermont's isolation worked against the museum. The rural location lacked interstate highway signage that might have directed tourists to the site. Competition from better located attractions drew visitors elsewhere. Attendance collapsed from 65,000 in 1973 to just 17,000 by 1981, a decline that made financial sustainability impossible. Then came the disaster that symbolized everything going wrong. In 1982, heavy snow collapsed the roof of the engine house, damaging locomotives that had been stored inside for protection. Canadian Pacific No. 1293 and Meadow River Lumber Shay No. 1 suffered exposure to elements that accelerated deterioration. Wooden cabs, bells, and other components that the roof had protected were now vulnerable to rain, snow, and freeze-thaw cycles. The roof collapse represented a cruel irony. Equipment that Blunt had rescued from scrapyards to preserve for future generations was now rotting because the foundation couldn't afford to maintain basic shelter. The collection that had been worth millions was losing value with every passing season. By 1982, the foundation began exploring relocation options. Orlando, Florida was considered briefly, but Scranton, Pennsylvania emerged as a leading candidate. The former industrial city saw Steamtown as an opportunity for economic redevelopment, and the foundation saw Scranton as a chance for survival. The last Vermont excursion ran on October 23, 1983, with Canadian Pacific No. 1246 pulling passengers on a 100-mile trip to Ludlow. After nearly 2 decades in the Green Mountain State, Steamtown was leaving behind the site where Blunt had hoped to build his dream. The collection was moving, but the damage was already done. Scranton, Pennsylvania, contracted to host Steamtown in May 1983, investing $2 million for the relocation and $13 million to renovate the former Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad Yard. City officials anticipated 200,000 to 400,000 annual visitors who would boost the local economy and help address unemployment that had reached 13%. The marriage of a struggling museum and a struggling city seemed like it might save both. The move took place between 1983 and 1985, with 40 locomotives and 60 cars shipped by rail and truck to their new home. The former DL&W yard provided 62 acres of space that dwarfed the Vermont site. The urban location promised better access for visitors traveling from major population centers along the East Coast. Excursions resumed in 1984 using Canadian Pacific No. 2317, running to Moscow, Pennsylvania, and other destinations. But the routes passed through industrial wastelands, including junkyards and abandoned factories, that disappointed visitors expecting scenic mountain railroading. The experience simply couldn't match what Vermont had offered. Attendance fell far short of projections, reaching only 60,000 in 1987 rather than the 200,000 minimum that city planners had anticipated. That gap between expectations and reality created financial pressure that the foundation could not withstand. Management turmoil compounded the problems. The 1986 firing of director James Gillespie signaled deeper organizational dysfunction. Leadership changes disrupted operations and undermined confidence among supporters and potential donors. The 1986 boiler explosion on Canadian Pacific No. 1278 during an excursion injured 3 visitors and highlighted the maintenance problems that had plagued operations since Blunt's death. The Foundation lacked resources to maintain equipment properly, and the accident demonstrated the dangerous consequences of deferred maintenance. By 1987, Steamtown faced $2.2 million in debt with no clear path to solvency. The Foundation filed for bankruptcy in December 1987 and dissolved entirely in 1988. The largest private railroad collection in American history was about to become something else entirely. The gamble had failed, but a controversial rescue was coming. Congressional intervention saved the collection from dispersal, but ignited controversy that would follow Steamtown for decades. Representative Joseph McDade of Pennsylvania secured $8 million for National Park Service studies in 1986, beginning a process that would eventually cost taxpayers far more than anyone initially anticipated. The NPS acquired the collection in 1988, resuming shuttle operations and excursions in 1989 while planning for a full-scale historic site. Trains crossed the Tuckhannock Viaduct on trips that gave visitors dramatic views of northeastern Pennsylvania's landscape. Critics questioned the acquisition from the beginning. NPS Director James Ridenour called it a second-rate collection in third-rate facilities in 1988, arguing that federal money should support established natural parks rather than a financially troubled railroad museum. The collection's heavy Canadian content raised questions about its relevance to American history. A 1991 NPS study valued the collection at $20 million, but recommended $62 million in improvements before the site could properly serve visitors. Federal funding eventually reached $66 million by initial estimates and climbed toward $176 million by 2008, making Steamtown one of the most expensive Park Service acquisitions relative to visitor numbers. Congressional overrides bypassed standard review processes that would normally evaluate whether proposed sites met NPS criteria. Accusations of pork barrel politics dogged the project, with critics arguing that Scranton's political connections, rather than the collection's historical significance, drove federal investment. The site opened as Steamtown National Historic Site in July 1995 with a rehabilitated roundhouse, museum exhibits, and regular excursion service. Attendance reached 212,000 in the opening year, suggesting that the investment might pay off in visitor engagement. But numbers declined steadily in subsequent years, dropping to 61,178 by 2006, before rebounding somewhat to around 100,000 annually. The site cost $5.2 million per year to operate, raising ongoing questions about value relative to investment. The collection had been saved, but much of it continued to rust. East of Steamtown's main complex lives an area that visitors call the Train Graveyard, a 10 to 15 acre expanse where unrestored locomotives and cars sit exposed to Pennsylvania's harsh weather. This boneyard holds surplus from Blunt's original collection, equipment that the National Park Service deemed unlikely to receive restoration due to high costs and limited resources. Canadian Pacific number 2929 sits in that graveyard, a 1936 Jubilee-type locomotive that represents the only example of its 4-4-4 wheel arrangement in the United States. Its maroon paint has faded to rust, its boiler shows corrosion from decades of exposure, and weeds grow around its wheels. The rarity that once made it valuable now seems irrelevant as it deteriorates in the open air. Brooks Scanlon number 1, a 1914 Baldwin logging locomotive, shows the effects of outdoor storage through cracked wooden cabs and rusted running gear. Built as a 262 Prairie type for timber operations, it now serves only as evidence of how quickly unprotected equipment can decay. Snowblowers, freight cars, and maintenance vehicles fill out the graveyard, each piece representing something Blunt once considered worth saving. A World War II troop sleeper converted for Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western use sits with warped metal from frost heave. Freight cars show collapsed roofs and broken trucks. Park rangers acknowledge that most pieces in the graveyard will never be restored. The cost of returning a steam locomotive to operating condition runs between $1 and $2 million, and limited budgets force prioritization of pieces with the strongest educational value or operational potential. Pennsylvania's freeze-thaw cycles accelerate the decay. Water seeps into cracks, freezes, expands, and breaks metal that might have lasted decades in covered storage. Each winter does damage that can't be undone, and the collection that Blunt spent his fortune assembling continues shrinking through deterioration. Urban explorers and railroad enthusiasts alike document the graveyard in videos and photographs, treating it as an unintentional monument to industrial decline. What began as a preservation effort has partially become a demonstration of preservation's failure. The machines Blunt rescued from scrapyards are becoming scraps themselves. Despite the losses, significant pieces from Blunt's collection have survived and even thrived under National Park Service stewardship. The operational roundhouse provides proper maintenance facilities that the Foundation never achieved, and some locomotives have returned to service for excursions and demonstrations. Baldwin No. 26, a 1929 switcher, returned to steam in 2015 after firebox repairs that allowed it to operate for yard shuttles and short runs. The small locomotive gives visitors the experience of seeing working steam power that larger, more complex engines can't provide without extensive restoration. Canadian National No. 3254, a 1917 Mikado type built by Canadian Locomotive Company, ran excursions until 2012 and demonstrated what the collection could offer when equipment received proper maintenance. Its operational service showed that Blunt's vision of sharing steam railroading with the public remained achievable. The Big Boy remains the collection's most impressive static display. Union Pacific No. 4012 received a $1.6 million cosmetic restoration in 2021 that addressed surface deterioration without attempting the impossible task of returning the million-pound locomotive to operation. Its size makes it permanently immobile, but its presence reminds visitors of what American steam power achieved at its peak. Archival holdings represent another form of preservation. The site maintains 208,142 history artifacts, over 4.6 million archival items, and thousands of archaeological objects from Blunt's era. Photographs, documents, and blueprints preserve information that supports restoration projects and historical research. Some pieces left Steamtown through trades designed to improve the collection's relevance to American railroad history. Canadian Pacific No. 2816, sold during the bankruptcy period, was later restored by Canadian Pacific Railway and operates today as a working locomotive. Others went to the Age of Steam Roundhouse and similar institutions where they received the care that Steamtown couldn't provide. Partnerships with organizations like the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania facilitate loans and collaborative preservation efforts. Reading T1 No. 2102 has visited Steamtown for special events, demonstrating how cooperation can expand what any single institution can offer visitors. Parts of Blunt's vision survived, other parts became lessons in what preservation requires. F. Nelson Blunt died before he could see either the triumphs or the tragedies that his collection would experience. The museum he envisioned remains partially realized at Steamtown National Historic Site, where over 100,000 visitors annually learn about steam railroading in the functional roundhouse and aboard excursion trains. His mission of preservation succeeded for the pieces that received attention and resources. But the train graveyard stands as testimony to what happens when preservation efforts exceed available resources. The locomotives rusting in the open air represent good intentions overwhelmed by the practical challenges of maintaining complex machinery. Each piece required ongoing investment that neither the Foundation nor the federal government could provide for the entire collection. The controversy over federal spending on Steamtown continues. Critics argue that taxpayer money could have been better spent on natural parks or on railroad museums with stronger collections and better locations. Defenders note that the site preserves an important industrial heritage and provides educational experiences unavailable elsewhere in the national park system. Climate presents ongoing challenges. Freeze-thaw cycles and precipitation continue damaging outdoor displays, prompting proposals for covered storage that will require additional investment. The preservation problems that began in Vermont and worsened in early Scranton have not been fully solved despite federal resources. Current leadership under Superintendent Jeremy M. Comash focuses on sustainability, seeking ways to maintain what exists while potentially restoring additional pieces for future excursions. Canadian National No. 3377 is among locomotives that might someday return to steam if resources allow. The story of America's largest private railroad collection illustrates both the passion that drives preservation and the enormous challenges it faces. Blunt saved locomotives that would otherwise have been scrapped, giving future generations the opportunity to see and experience steam railroading. That his collection partially rusted away doesn't erase what he accomplished. Steam locomotives require constant attention to survive. They were built to be worked, maintained, and eventually replaced, not to last forever as monuments. The pieces that have survived at Steamtown exist because someone invested the resources to keep them alive. The pieces rusting in the graveyard show what happens when those resources run out. Blunt's dream lives on, but rust never sleeps. F. Nelson Blunt spent his fortune saving steam locomotives that American railroads had abandoned. He built the largest private collection in the country, imagining a museum that would preserve steam power forever. His death left that collection vulnerable, and decades of financial struggles, relocations, and deferred maintenance took their toll. Today, some of his locomotives operate for visitors at Steamtown National Historic Site, while others rust in a graveyard that shows how easily preservation can fail. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of the machines that time forgot.